So here you're looking at my game plan for out of position turn probe. I went ahead and jumped straight to the filled in version of this simply because a lot of the strategies are quite obvious in translating here. Turn probe is the line where in position misses their flop c-bet. So all that has to happen to get to this point of filling out the game plan is you open up different flop textures, and I'm using flop textures that are identical to the flop c-betting textures in the first place because the game tree hasn't been impacted by any betting. So it is important to think about which of these flop textures are going to get checked more often than others. But this comes directly from our in-position flop c-bet game plan. It's quite easy to figure out where the checks are going to happen more often or less often. And I've pretty much ranked the priority of these turn probe situations for that metric. So low boards that get big bets, two Broadway boards that get big bets. These are going to have some of the highest checking frequencies. So you're going to get the most turn probes. I marked low as a high priority situation because not only is it going to have a lot of checking on the flop, it's also going to have a lot of turn probing. So you can see here that the check frequency from out of position on low cards and on straight cards is low, although the check frequency on a high card is high. In comparison, you could scan through, for example, like these medium boards with no straights possible have a lot of checking. These three straight boards have a lot of checking. These two Broadway boards have a lot of checking. That said, they are less common situations to find yourself in, so I rated them as as medium priority. And these first couple of textures, paired boards and high-low-low textures, they just get a ton of c-betting. So it's really not that important to study this turn probing spot. There's even some that I completely left off of here just because they're rare textures or they're range bet textures. For example, ace high is absent from here. But you will, of course, see some checking in those situations. So it's worth preparing in some way. So let's talk about how I would prepare for turn probes. The best way, as I recommend very frequently, to improve in this area is to do training. But what I'm hoping to help you with is figuring out a better method for that, a more targeted method of training, and also a targeted method of study. So certainly there's nothing wrong with spending time. In this video, I'm not going to, but there's certainly nothing wrong with spending time in the solutions, looking at what turn probe structure looks like. I think it's important to learn where it's okay to be merged. A hint would be to look at all the spots where the bet sizings are small. I think it's okay to learn where it's good to be polar. And again, a hint would be to look at all the spots where bet sizing is large. That said, what is the minimum value hand that you're going to be thinking about in a polar strategy? That's a very useful thing to be studying in the time that if you think you need theoretical work on turn probing. What is the strongest hand that's going to be bluffing when we go for small size or when we go for big size? Again, these are good things to be studying. But because of the scope of this sheet, this is already a lot of information on here. I found that this is the best way for me to think about turn probing structure or turn probing game plan. So when I looked at my database, I found that, first let's talk about the stats that are here. There's a number of interactions with turn probe that I think are important to analyze in your own game. And one of the most common that I find people struggle with is thinking about what happens once they check this opportunity. So in a lot of game environments, this is not an important area to play defense. Fold to delay c-bet in a game like Six Max Cash, where flop c-betting is so common and range asymmetry can be really large. Fold to delay c-bet in theory can be quite high. I think fold to delay c-bet can be like in the high 50s or 60% or something in a lot of the Six Max solutions I've looked at. simply because it's not important to play defense, and it's not possible to play defense in this line with the range asymmetry that you have. So playing good defense here is not necessarily important for your game, but it is an area that's important in heads up because there is no range asymmetry here. And there's going to be plenty of weak hands that check back flops and then start bluffing turns. So I find that a lot of my students struggle to think about playing a checking range once they've been given the chance to be aggressive in this turn probe opportunity. Usually they're aggressive enough with turn probing and they're aggressive enough with river follow through. That's what this stat is here, river follow through after their turn probe gets called. And this is not an area where I think that having more aggression is too difficult for that many people. Where I think a lot of people struggle is playing check raises. And I've only included the check raise on the turn here. There's also, of course, the check call turn, check raise river line. But having delayed check raises is a really valuable part of a tough game plan. And I think that setting up drills that encourage you to think both about check raising and turn probing is a valuable way to study this area. Additionally, when you're reviewing your solutions for this spot, you want to have that holistic approach where you're thinking about the whole range of possibilities that you're playing here. It's not just a decision of, do I bet with this hand? It's categorization of which hands are the right hand strength for me to be betting, which ones are the right hand strength for me to be checking and thinking about check raising. And furthermore, do I want to check call the turn or do I want to check raise the turn? Considering that you could check raise the river after check calling the turn. So all of those things intersect here at the turn probe opportunity. There's a lot of decision points, and almost never do I run into a player who gets here and comes up with a balanced strategy with the whole thing. So you can see that the way I was playing, it seems that I perhaps overprotected or spent a lot of energy protecting my checking range and playing good defense and good check raising strategies in this spot. But as a result, my turn probe was low. I think this is just a lack of having that 25% bet in a lot of situations. There's a lot of paired boards, 4 straight boards, paired boards, triple low card boards, where that 25% bet was useful. I don't do a whole lot of this. And I also suspect, similar to my other turn strategies, that I'm just missing some low frequency, like neutral EV bluffs with certain hands that don't look like very attractive bluffs. So I could work on increasing my turn probe frequency and not worrying so much about check calling or check raising enough. But that said, I think for the average player, having more check raises, not necessarily check calls, because it's not an area I'm so concerned about protecting or bluff catching. It's not the most successful bluff catching line in a lot of game formats. But being capable of check raises here is very important. So thinking about not only, overbet turn probes or block bet turn probes, but also thinking about check raises at the same time. I think that's going to make you more dangerous. So let's have a look at some training, and I'll talk about that as I play some hands. Just going to show you the setup here in the way that it's going to be different from previous drills that I've set up. Of course, we're looking at the single raise pot script that I've got here, and we're playing the out of position player. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to play the hand to the end, and I want to start it at the turn once the flop went check, check. So what I'm doing is I'm giving myself the turn probe opportunity. I'm giving myself the full scope of possibilities here. And I want to put myself through scenarios where I'm occasionally checking, occasionally betting, but the hand does not end there. I want to be able to play through the full remainder of decisions, because this is a very complicated node, and I wouldn't want to focus too much on just whether I bet or check this hand. I want to also play through some of those check raising situations or check calling situations. The other thing I'm going to do in the drill setup for this particular one is I'm going to set up some flop filters. So because I'm interested in turn probing and I want to focus on the more relevant textures where turn probing is going to happen, I want to take away paired and trips boards. I'm choosing to take away monotone boards, although I know that those could be useful to study in this area. They're just kind of rare, and I think they get overrepresented in this data set. And I'm also removing king and ace high boards. So I'm restricting to queen high boards and lower. And I'm not going to do anything with connectedness. You could certainly get more repetitions of the highest frequency check boards by making the boards a little more connected. But I think even fairly disconnected queen and jack and 10 high boards are going to be useful for me to study. So I'm just going to restrict it in this way and get to the drill. Okay, so this is a high frequency betting situation with 7-6. I think I could check or bet. Feels to me like a good potential check raise, but also a good potential large bet. So I'm going to go with overbet and see what it tells me. So as you could see, it was doing a mix of everything. I think actually because we're trying to emphasize a balanced strategy and a very distributed strategy between options, I am going to use my randomizer for the remainder of this. So I'm going to be thinking about using low numbers to determine passive options and high numbers to determine aggressive options. This river spot is favorable to me, although after calling the overbet, I think it might just be too thin to bet this hand. Not my favorite check call either, because I block a lot of the hands that will turn into bluffs, but he could turn a 5 into a bluff as well. I have a feeling it's just a check. Okay, so we do get the same board a couple times in a row, which is nice. I think this hand mostly wants to bet. I don't think it's a great check raising candidate. And the reason for that is it's just not that great of a check in the first place. It doesn't have that much equity. It doesn't have that much showdown value. So I think I'm going to go with 75%. When we get called, I think we have a pretty good follow through hand. We unblock a lot of stuff like king 5, ace 9. The jack and the 10 should be okay cards to follow through. On the 3, I think most of my 75% range from the turn gets to continue going about 75% on this card. Blocking would be more of a thing had I blocked the turn. But I didn't block the turn, so I'm probably not going to block this river. I don't think I want to overbet either with this, with like a pure miss. I think I would rather bet 75%. So there's no overbetting happening. Could give up. Seems reasonable. So this hand, I think if I'm checking, it's to check call. It is way too strong to check raise as a bluff. If I'm probing, it's for value. I think on a board pair low, I think I just want to do a lot of probing small, and that's going to help with my increased probing frequency. It looks like 3/4 was actually fine for this hand, so I might be undervaluing it a little bit. The king is a bad river. Don't think I can still block. I think I have to check. Okay, so blocking is close. So now we're at the stage where I think check raising is a reasonable option. I have a pretty good hand to do something with here. I don't think it's like a mandatory check call by any means. I'm also going to play a lot of 5s this way. And I'm going to play 4s with better kickers this way. So like having the 6 makes me more interested in check raising than check calling. I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know how high. So usually check raise frequencies in these spots are way higher than you would expect. I'm just going to go for it and see what happens. The typical sizing that I would go for here is this like 2x pot sizing, I think, because trips should be fine. Straight for sure should be fine. But I don't necessarily want to just jam because I do think I run into some full houses in these situations, and a hand like ace deuce or 6-7 is probably too thin to be all in. Okay, so fold call and the size raise that I made, but only 2% of the time, so probably overdoing it a little bit there. 9-6. Again, this seems like a high frequency betting area. I just learned from the previous repetition that 3/4 pot was reasonable. I think again my hand's a little weak to think about checking to check raise, so I'd rather just be upfront aggressive with my bet here. I get raised, which a lot of my opponents would never do. or very rarely do. Definitely a good play to be raising turn probes more. I would just fold this in game. I think 3-betting is plausible, but with no club, just like a single open ender, not even drawing to the nuts, I think we just fold. 7-5. So here it's a 4-liner. I made a note that I could be block betting range on low 4-liners. This one's a little higher, but I'm just going to test that strategy to see how close it is. Seems like it's good. My hand feels close to being able to block again. I have a good kicker, which matters. I think a lot of 9s will check back this flop. And if I check, do I like my bluff catcher? It's not bad. I unblock like 5-4 and like Jack 3 suited type hands. So I think we could block or check, and I'll make use of my randomizer. I hate knowing the problem I have with this randomizer is that I know the number right away because I looked at it. I prefer when I'm actually playing to decide what my frequency is going to be first and then click my randomizer and then I get a number. The problem here is that now I see this and I think like, oh, that's a high-ish number, but like I never decided what my frequency was going to be. Anyway, I'm going to go for 25%. That's just a small aside on how to use randomizers. I don't like knowing the number before I've decided what the frequency I'm rolling for is. Okay, so it's pure. Good to know that I found a more aggressive line there. So again, I think, betting pretty much everything for block is reasonable here. Let's just see if that continues to work out in my favor. And we get the same river. So do I like blocking again? Blocking again seems okay if I can clear out those king high and ace high draws. I'm not sure that they always fold. I do have lower hands to bluff, and I have a shred of showdown value here. So I'm going to play this as not a pure bluff. And again, I just see my randomizer here. Okay, so it should be a pure bluff. That's interesting. We're definitely folding once we check. But I wouldn't have recognized that as a pure bluff. Probably overestimating how many combinations of like high cards and undercards there are on that texture. So this is a large betting spot, I believe, because it's not like the top card didn't change. So I think my turn probing strategy here is 75%. But my hand is reasonably showdownable here and can continue to a bet in a variety of ways. I could check call or check raise. I often use that as a determining factor to support my checking range and find more check raises. So that would be my recommendation for like how to find. This is a good starting point for how to find more check raises, is to think first about just the quality of checking with this hand, and don't just think, oh, I have a draw, I could bet, I could get some better hands to fold. That's all true. But if I'm specifically looking for hands that could check, then I will find more ways to check raise. The 9 river, I think my hand just has too much showdown value to bluff. Okay, so I could bet 75%. So here it's a big betting spot. I have some showdown. I have nothing special when it comes to blockers. I just check. And I still think my hand is too strong to bluff river. Facing a bet, I don't see this as good properties for check raising. It seems a little bit weak to be check calling. I think the king highs, for the most part, are just the check folding range. So we've got another 4-liner where I'm testing out range bet small. And we're just going to continue with this idea. So it's definitely not like lining up in theory. I just want to see, if these are substantial EV mistakes anywhere, because I actually think that would work extremely well in practice. So this is one where the low flop gets the overcard turn. I was playing this as, I think, overbet with a lot of checking. If I'm thinking about overbet, queen 9 is too thin for value. So I think I would just check. Looks like 75% would have been fine. But if my determined strategy is to overbet or check, then I think this is just a fine check. Now that it has checked through, this is usually, I don't know if I've said this before in a different video, but like normally when you're considering overbet on the previous street and you check through, that continues to be the structure on the next street, or at least it's part of the structure on the next street. So all the queens that didn't bet turn now have a ton of value. The question against my average opponent now is like, do I prefer to check raise this card because they're going to hit a 10 somewhat often? Or would I rather overbet and get called by like a 5? And that's, I think both options are reasonable. If I'm using this randomizer as an arbitrary 50-50 mix for some reason, then I rolled high and I would use that to overbet rather than to check. But if I checked, it would be to check raise. And the 10 is a reasonable card to check raise, I think. So here, polarized strategy, clearly going to check. You can see that the sim doesn't mind block betting, but that's just not part of my game plan on this texture. Although I think the high, low, low, when it got a third low card, so that's like a reverse of this situation. Like if the queen was on the flop and the deuce was on the turn or something, then I was using some 25%. Anyway, board pairs on the river. I think this is a spot where, and this is almost like I forget if I do river stab in single raise pots later on, but I know I did river stab in 3-bet pots in this course. But river stab, this is often a spot where I lean towards block betting and overbetting. This hand is a reasonable overbet, of course. Although if I check, I always want to consider check. My hand is too weak to check raise, I think. On a 3 club and a board pair that villain could have, my hand is too weak to check raise. So this is a value categorization that can help you think about how to check raise versus check call, or check raise versus probe. Think about if your hand is strong enough to raise once you check and face that bet. The queen 9 in the previous hand was strong enough to raise if I checked and faced like a half pot or even a full pot bet. But here, if I check and I face full pot, I'm calling. Or if I check and I face half pot, I'm probably calling, maybe raising 3x. I don't know. I think it's just a call. So for that reason, I should be more inclined to probe this hand. And my options with probing are like big bet, try to get called by whatever, a deuce, a 7, I don't know. Or block bet and try and get raised. Both seem fine. So I'll use my, I think there's a lot of block betting here. It might even be 3/4, but I think there's just a lot of like not overbetting here with other parts of my range. So I'm going to use this low randomizer as help that says, let's protect our small bets with this pretty good hand. That's obviously going to call. So it was just an overbet, but we didn't lose much EV. So I'm okay with my process there. Certainly calling this. Had I overbet, I would have gotten raised, and then I would have had a terrible spot. So here we do a lot of 3/4, I think. Sometimes I use this to protect my checking range. Maybe I do it too much. So let's test the betting a little bit. No, would have been a fine check. It's actually preferred. I was going to say I use this because not only is it a weak 5, so low kicker, but it's also lacking a straight card. So I would rate a lot of other 5s. This is probably the worst 5 in the deck. It lacks a gutter. All the lower 5s have a gutter or an open ender, and all the higher 5s have a higher kicker. So this is the worst 5. Usually a pretty good shortcut to figuring out that you should, use this to support your checking range. So maybe I should have listened to my own advice there. But now that I'm here at the river, the 9's an amazing card. I think I do a lot of 3/4 here. I think this hand is good enough, probably. Block. Okay, so first significant EV mistake here. Overrating my hand, perhaps not recognizing that the 75% on the flop was a bit of an overplay. Or sorry, the 75% on the turn. It's a bit of an overplay. So Queen Jack looking to me like a viable bluff. If I check, it's a little awkward facing a bet. I don't like it too much as check raise, but it's a pretty decent hand to be check folding. So again, I think this pushes me towards the probing a little bit. So it's not great. Like it's not a big EV mistake to probe this hand, but it seems that this hand just wants to check. And I'm thinking about the downside, like, oh, if I check and I face a bet, then it's not great. But I'm not thinking about the upside, which is if I check, they check back with ace high, which is probably really good for my hand. So probably should have just checked. Let them check back with ace high. Sometimes I get trapped in that logic where you assume the bet is coming and it's only actually coming like 30% of the time. So you want to be careful with just determining your whole strategy based on what happens if they bet. So this is that high, low, low with a third low card where I think block betting is an option, but this hand is just too weak. I need to check this hand. And I face 3/4 on a spade. I think I'm just folding this hand. I'm pretty sure it's too weak to call. It's a viable combo to think about raising and in the scheme of like, oh, blocking the turned whatever, the turn 2 pair, the turn set. But honestly, when it's 3 straight 3 flush, I think that the value of that goes out the window and it's more about having like a 3 or a 6 or a spade in your hand. So it's between fold and call, and fold is fine. So again, thinking about small bets here, queen 10, pretty strong hand to be small betting with. Could protect my checking range when I lack the redraw. So I lack the spades and I lack the whatever. Sometimes I like to check these hands. I actually don't mind that play. I like to check these hands sometimes so that I can increase the options that I have to like check raise rivers or even check raise turn if they go for a small bet. I know it's like kind of an unintuitive hand strength to be thinking about check raising. But in heads up, we get to go much wider in general. So this might be, in a 6-max setting, this might be the equivalent of having like bottom 2 pair or something on the same texture, if I had to roughly compare the equities. So I think when you view it that way, it makes more sense that I'm considering check raise. And it could have been check call turn, check decide river, or like, check turn. Now on the 5, it was a high frequency overbet situation for trips. That means this might go into block bet. This might go into check. I don't think my hand is good enough to overbet, although I could be mistaken. I'm inclined to block because I think that does a good job of targeting all the hands that check back that I don't want to check back. And I think overbetting is overplaying my hand strength. Oh. So overbetting is the play. Okay. Not a huge EV mistake, but significant enough to make it a full frequency overbet. So I'm picking up as I play through this line that actually the river stab situation is where I'm making larger inaccuracies than the turn probe situation. Now I'm here to study the turn probe. I think this hand just checks. Oh, interesting. 22% of the time. So this is getting to the point of the training, which is turn probing. This is the type of bluff that I never take that might be holding back my frequency without making an EV mistake, right? Like, again, we played this hand well. We got a great job and a check mark. But if I never bluff this hand ever, then my overall turn probing frequency is too low and my opponents can overfold. So I do think that this is a noteworthy result for me to recognize that just having like the 9x and maybe also the deuce being like an unblocker to weak hands and blocking 10 deuce suited. I don't know. When I say unblocking weak hands, I mean just the automatic folding range because a lot of deuces fold pre. So the way I would normally play this spot is once it checks down, I do some overbetting and some block betting. This hand seems viable to do both. The 9's a good blocker for the overbet, and I get to go as thin as a jack. So yeah, I'm definitely betting. So this is a spot where I'm not check raising simply because I don't want to check and have my opponent show down like queen 6. So I need to bet. It's just a decision between sizes. And I think overbet's going to be pretty common here. I'm just going to go with that. Yeah, 55%. Cool. So this, I mean, I think the 9 was what was relevant, and maybe the deuce as well. I think this is just a check. And now we get the ace. So this one's harder. On the ace, so before it was a 7. The 7 was a good card for us to bluff. It was a low card. It misses ace high. It misses king high. On the ace, we don't bet that often for value. And we have all sorts of low cards that missed. We have tons of 9 high, 8 high, 7 high. So this is not, I think, a pure bluffing situation for that reason. And if I bet, I think it's supposed to be block for like my jacks and maybe my weak aces. But we roll a 38 here. I don't think I'm supposed to bluff this 2/3 of the time. So let's check. Okay, I'm just never supposed to bluff it. Great. So high frequency turn probe, probably 3/4 sizing. Queen 7. I mean, doesn't look to me like a bluff, but again, this might just be the hand that's supposed to bet like 20% of the time and I miss it. No, it's just a check. Okay. Jack, another good card for me. Generally speaking, I definitely would have bluffed on a low connected card. On the jack, I'm not so confident, but it does look like a hand that's low enough to qualify as a bluff. If I would mostly bet 75% here because I think that's what I can bet with my Jack X and 10X. Maybe even like King 9. Yeah, I'm just not sure if Queen 7 qualifies. I'm going to guess that it does. Let's see what happens. Cool. It's close. Right in there. So yeah, a lot of 3/4. Could do some checking. I do have one of my weakest top pairs. But on a board this low with a betting frequency this high, I don't think this is the type of hand to mix. I think I want to mix like my 9X. Okay, I could have checked, but I'm okay with that mistake. Here, it's an overcard to the board. That means it's going to be very low frequency and probably overbet. Ace 9 just seems like a pure check. So we face quarter, which I don't see a lot of. Which means we're going to be doing a lot more check raising against this size. It could be the setup of my sim that encourages this in some way. I can only go 6.1 or 18.6. Either way, I think this hand is too good to fold for the sizing, although it strikes me as close. And as a check raise candidate, I just don't really see it. I don't see why I would choose this hand. And I check so often here that I'm going to have a ton of options. I could have 5-3 suited. I could have ace-5, ace-3. Even something like ace-6 seems better just to have that like future blocker when the straight comes in. Yeah, I don't think the 9's ever going to be relevant. So I think it's check call or check fold. We're going to go with call. Cool. And we never lead this card. And they just have 3s. Well played. If that, by the way, like if that was close in EV to folding, I would probably recommend folding in game for a lot of people. So again, polarized. I don't think Queen X ever makes it into the betting range. So again, you can see like the sim is giving the feedback that the small bet was being used. But if your game plan does not involve the small bet, then you can safely ignore these kind of bets. It is, of course, possible to reconfigure the sims before you get into the training to remove these bets entirely. It's just that sometimes I want them. So the problem is on some textures I want them, on some textures I don't. So I actually think this is a better training method to force yourself to look at the option, to force yourself to be given the choice to bet 1.2 and actually have to refuse it, to recognize like, oh no, I'm not doing that. And this is better because when you're playing, you have every option. There's no restrictions, right? You're not put in a box that says, hey, this is the best bet size. And as much as I like DTO as a training method, I mean, I will give a shout out to them for having a really good quality program, a lot of accurate bet sizing that has already been trimmed down for you. But I think that's somewhat problematic in itself, is that it doesn't present to you the wrong option often enough. So it doesn't force you to choose to avoid the wrong option. But when you're playing, you have to choose to avoid the wrong option. So I do think to some extent it's better to play a simulation like this where you've chosen the bet sizes you're going to be considering personally, and then among the bet sizes that you personally are considering, you're forced to trim down to only the ones that are appropriate for this situation. So that's the way that I've set this up, and I think that's a important exercise to go through. So here on the board pair, I think that overbet and block are reasonable options. My preference is block against a lot of human opponents. My randomizer's high, so let's take the aggressive option. I actually underplayed it. I could have bet 75%. Now this raise, I think, is the sizing that would be taken by a king. I don't think this is ever a chop. Obviously, it could be a bluff. I have a bluff catcher. But I don't think I have a mandatory call. So, yeah, honestly, I have no idea. I mean, I know for sure that the only removal that comes to mind beneficially would be removing a 4, and having the offsuit 9 does not remove a 4. So that's bad. So I'm going to use that as my decision to fold. Very interesting that this is this must just be a hand strength call, I guess, because I can have a deuce for value. So I think I've gone through enough detail in this node to enter the review stage. And when I make a mistake that big, it just kind of pulls me out of it a little bit. Like, it pulls me out of the training to the point where I want to resolve that mistake. So imposition is actually raising chops for value against this bet size. So the original bet size, from my point of view, is being used by a lot of pocket pairs and a lot of deuce X, which is surprisingly thin to me, but it makes sense. So we are going down to deuce X for value here, which, yeah, I mean, if I knew that we were going down to deuce X, then I would probably be pretty reluctant to fold a queen to a raise. But I mean, we also have, and I need to make sure I'm not getting confused by the coloring here, because a lot of these bets are 3/4. So a lot of king X and queen X are going 3/4. And the block is almost exclusively deuce X and pocket pairs. So the queen was just, yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And imposition had the option to raise all sorts of sizes, but they started going for the thinner raise. I guess they just have a lot more queens than they do kings. I mean, honestly, it looks pretty similar. They have a very similar amount of queens and kings. But they have so many queens, and they generate EV by raising those queens. So they raise. We build like a 3-betting strategy with some trips and some deuces for bluffs. And we just call when we have a queen. Okay. This makes sense to me. So a little bit underplaying there. Let's look at the other somewhat large mistake that I made. So this is on topic with the turn probing. Here, 75% predominant sizing. I went with 8-5, which you can see here is just getting checked. And like I kind of suggested in game, so a hand like 7-5 or a hand like 6-5 is a lot stronger on this texture, or at least it's more interested in betting. And I'll maybe use this example just to kind of highlight the types of hands that are preferring to bet and the types of hands that are preferring to check. So having interaction with the board for a thin value bet, that's definitely in support of betting. So having interaction with the board, like, 7-5, even 7-4 suited or 6-4 suited, 6-3 suited, like all the thin value bets are encouraged by the addition of interaction with the straight card. I'm assuming spades are acting a similar way. So like, yeah, 10-3 of spades is more likely to bet than 10-3 of diamonds, or king 5, queen 5, jack 5, whatever. These hands are a lot more likely to bet than their counterparts with no spade draw. So when I don't have the straight redraw, when I don't have the spade redraw, I'm doing a lot more checking, and that's because this is just a weak pair that would rather check call and keep the pot smaller in the face of not knowing that the run out will help them. But if you're more impervious to the run out, if you have more backup, then you're more willing to bet, grow the pot, narrow the range, deal with the river card as it comes. Now, when you have less showdown value, then I think the same thing is true. Like if you just have trash, you're more inclined to check because you're not trying to grow the pot with no backup plan. You're just trying to check fold. But if you have trash with equity, trash with backup, I mean, this is also removal effect on the calling range. So it goes both ways. You have more equity, you also have more removal on the calling range. But once you start to get showdown value, you can actually see that like ace X with that backup, with that draw is going into the checking range. And this is where I was talking like with the queen 10 hand. I was talking about having showdown value and equity. If you have both of those things combined, now you're moving into that category of like checking is a good idea because I can realize my equity, but also if I face a bet, I might do something. I might put in a check raise. If I'm thinking about made hands as well, you can see that, for example, like let's see, some low two pairs. So some 4-3s and 5-3s, and even sets like pocket threes and pocket fours. These are doing more checking in comparison to, I don't know, like, I mean, the thin value, right? But also even more checking than like 7-6. A lot of these hands are debating how often they're going to face action when they check, and the removal effect that they have. So the removal they have on calling hands, but also the removal they have on betting hands when they check is going to impact their interest in like checking to check raise or checking to check call and raise river. And you can see that if you like explore the details of which straights are betting versus checking or which two pairs are betting versus checking. I don't want to speculate too closely on this sim because it's relatively low accuracy. But I would encourage you, if you're struggling to understand the idea of building a check raising range versus a probing range, to take a close look at a situation like this and just write out all the different hands that are checking to check raise the turn, checking to check call the turn, betting to bet call the turn, betting to bet fold the turn, and putting them into those groups and trying to make sense of the structure is a worthwhile exercise for sure, to make sure that you have like your system in place for these are the hands I like to check raise, these are the hands I like to bet. I think that's where I'm going to wrap this up. So hopefully that was interesting to you about the different nodes that branch off at the turn probe opportunity. And I definitely got a decent bit out of this training and recognizing that I need more work on the river situations, like the check down to river situations. That seems to be an area of focus that I need.